The bus dropped Maddie Holt at the corner of Birchwood and Lane Street at exactly 3:41 on Wednesday afternoon, the same corner it had dropped her at every school day since September, and she stepped down onto the sidewalk with her backpack slung over one shoulder the way she always wore it, already thinking about the math worksheet she had finished on the bus and the show she wanted to watch before dinner. Her mind occupied with the small, ordinary concerns of an 8-year-old at the end of an ordinary school day, rather than anything that should have required the specific, careful attention her father had spent years quietly training into her. The walk from the corner to her front door was a half block, 6 houses, a distance she could cover in under 2 minutes without hurrying, and she had walked it alone since the spring, her parents having decided, after careful discussion and a great deal of practiced preparation, that she was old enough to manage this small stretch of independence on her own, as long as she followed the rules her father had drilled into her, with the patient repetition of a man who took the rules considerably more seriously than most parents took such rules. Not because he expected anything to ever actually happen, but because Dale Holt had learned, across a great many years and a great many situations, that careful preparation cost nothing and sometimes mattered enormously. She was halfway down the block, passing the Garrison's yard with its tall hedge that always smelled faintly of something sweet in the autumn, when a gray sedan she did not recognize pulled up slowly along the curb beside her, matching her pace exactly, the passenger window already lowered. Maddie did not stop walking. This was the first rule, the one her father had repeated to her more times than any of the others, that you never stopped walking for a car, you kept moving, and you watched the car without making it obvious you were watching it. And Maddie, 8 years old and following a rule she had practiced so many times it had become almost automatic, kept her feet moving and her eyes forward, while some other part of her attention tracked the car beside her with the specific, careful precision her father had spent years building into her. The man driving leaned slightly toward the open window and said her name, or something close enough to her name that for half a second the wrongness of it did not fully register. Maddie instead of Maddie. A small difference that most adults who actually knew her would never have made. And he told her, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound friendly and ordinary and was not quite succeeding, that her dad had sent him to pick her up today, that there had been some kind of change of plans, and that she should get in the car so he could take her to him. Maddie stopped walking. This was the second time in roughly 4 seconds that her body had done something her father's training had specifically prepared it to do without her needing to consciously decide it. The first being her continued walking, the second being this sudden stillness. Because the second rule, the one that mattered more than any of the others, was that if anyone at all, claimed to be sent by her father, they had to say a specific word first. A word that only Maddie and her mother and her father knew, and if they did not say it, it did not matter what else they said or how friendly they sounded or how official the whole thing seemed. The answer was always no, and the action was always the same. Run, straight home, as fast as her legs could carry her. No hesitation, no further conversation, no trying to figure out whether the person seemed nice enough to maybe be telling the truth. The man had not said the word. He had said her almost name, and he had said her father's name, and he had said, "Get in the car." And none of that mattered at all next to the simple absence of 4 specific syllables that should have come before any of it. And Maddie, 8 years old, standing very still on the sidewalk in front of the Garrison's sweet-smelling hedge for exactly 1/2 of 1 second, turned and ran. She ran the way her father had practiced with her in their own backyard more times than either of them could count. Full speed, not glancing back, straight down the remaining length of the block toward her own front door. And behind her she heard the car door open, heard a man's voice calling something after her that she could not make out over the sound of her own breathing and her own sneakers hitting the pavement. And she did not stop, did not slow down, did not look back even once, because looking back was not part of the rule, and Maddie, in that moment, was following the rule with the same complete, unthinking precision a much older person might have envied. She reached her own front door, hit the door handle hard enough to nearly miss it the first time, got it open, and slammed it behind her, the sound of it loud enough in the quiet afternoon house that her mother Sandra, working at the kitchen table on a stack of paperwork, was already half out of her chair before Maddie even reached the kitchen doorway. Her daughter's face white and her breathing ragged in a way that told Sandra, before a single word was spoken, that something had happened that fell well outside the ordinary range of an 8-year-old's after-school excitement. Dale was home that particular afternoon, an unusual but not impossible occurrence given his schedule, sitting at the same kitchen table going through chapter paperwork of his own, and he was on his feet and across the kitchen before Sandra had even finished asking Maddie what was wrong, crouching down immediately to exactly his daughter's eye level, the way he always did when something serious needed to pass between them, his hands steady on her shoulders, even though everything underneath that steadiness was already beginning to move at a speed he would not let either of them see. Maddie told them in the broken, half-coherent way an 8-year-old recounts the most frightening thing that has happened to her. The gray car, the man, the wrong version of her name, the claim that her father had sent him, and then, her voice steadying slightly as she reached the detail that mattered most, the fact that he never said the word, that she waited and he never said it, and that was how she knew. And Dale, listening to his daughter explain with perfect, devastating clarity exactly how the safety training he had spent years building into her had functioned exactly as designed in the one moment it actually needed to, felt something move through his chest that had no name simple enough to speak aloud. Relief and fury arriving in the same instant and refusing to separate from each other. He asked her, gently, careful not to let anything in his voice frighten her further, whether she remembered anything about the car, the color, anything written on it, what the man looked like. And Maddie, still breathing hard but already steadying, in the way children sometimes steady faster than adults expect once the actual danger has passed, told him the car was gray, an ordinary gray, and that it had a sticker on the back window, blue and white, though she could not remember what it said, and that the man had short hair and a jacket the same color as the car, almost. And Dale listened to every detail with the same disciplined attention he brought to chapter business, filing each piece away with care. And when Maddie finished, he kissed the top of her head, told her she had done exactly the right thing, every single part of it, and stood up, his hand briefly on Sandra's shoulder as he crossed the kitchen toward the phone. He did not call the police first. He called Rick. The safety lessons had started 3 years earlier when Maddie was 5, not because Dale had any specific reason to expect danger, but because he had learned, across 2 decades inside the chapter, that the world occasionally found its way to the people closest to him, regardless of how carefully he tried to keep his 2 lives separate. And he had decided, with the same deliberate discipline he brought to everything else in his life, that his daughter was going to grow up knowing exactly what to do if that world ever found its way to her specifically. He had not approached it the way most parents approached stranger danger conversations, the vague and frightening warnings that left children either too scared to function normally or not scared enough to actually retain the lesson. He had built it instead into something closer to a game, practiced regularly enough that it became muscle memory rather than abstract fear, the same way Dale himself had been trained, years earlier and in considerably harsher circumstances, to respond to certain situations without needing to consciously think his way through them first. The code word had been Sandra's idea originally, suggested one evening at the kitchen table when Maddie was 5.5, the two of them trying to figure out the clearest possible way to give their daughter a single, reliable test she could apply to any adult claiming to have been sent by one of them. They settled eventually on a word that meant nothing to anyone outside the family, chosen specifically because it was unusual enough that nobody would stumble onto it by accident, and simple enough that Maddie could remember it under pressure. And they practiced it constantly across the following years, Dale occasionally testing her at random moments, asking her what she would do if someone she did not know told her he was there to pick her up, watching her work through the logic out loud until the response became as automatic as breathing. He remembered one particular lesson clearly, sitting with Maddie on the back porch when she was 6, walking her through exactly what running looked like. Not a panicked scramble, but a full, committed sprint. No hesitation, no pausing to consider whether the person seemed nice. Because the entire point of the rule, he had told her, crouched at her eye level the way he always did for anything serious, was that it removed the need to make a judgment call in a moment when judgment calls were exactly the wrong tool for the job. The rule did the deciding, so she did not have to, and all she had to do was follow it, completely, every single time, without exception, even if it turned out later that the person really had been harmless and she had simply overreacted. Because being wrong about overreacting cost nothing, and being wrong about a real threat could cost everything. Maddie had asked him once, around age 7, whether anyone would ever actually try something like that. And Dale had told her honestly that he did not know, that he hoped not, but that hoping not was not a plan, and the lessons were the plan, and that the lessons mattered exactly the same amount whether anything ever happened or not, because the value of being prepared did not depend on the emergency actually arriving. In the present, in the kitchen, with Maddie now sitting at the table with a glass of water Sandra had pressed into her hands, and Rick already on his way over, having heard everything in 4 sharp sentences over the phone, Maddie's breathing had steadied into something closer to ordinary, the specific resilience of a child who has just survived something frightening and is already, with the particular adaptability children sometimes show that adults struggle to match, beginning to process it as something that happened rather than something still happening. Dale crouched beside her chair again, his voice deliberately even, and asked her if she felt up to trying to remember a few more details, explaining gently that the more she could remember now, while it was still fresh, the better the chance of figuring out exactly who the man was and making sure he never tried anything like this again with anyone. Maddie nodded, sitting up slightly straighter, and Dale recognized in that small shift something that struck him with a force nearly equal to the earlier fear. That his daughter was not simply waiting to be comforted and protected from this experience. She was actively choosing to help. And Dale, watching her, felt a fierce and complicated pride move through the same chest that had been hollowed out by fear only minutes earlier. Rick arrived 11 minutes after the call, letting himself in through the front door the way he had for years, and found Dale and Sandra both at the kitchen table with Maddie, a small notepad already in front of Dale with a handful of details written down in his own controlled handwriting. Gray sedan, blue and white sticker on rear window, short-haired man, dark jacket, approximate age 30 to 40. Rick sat down across from Maddie without any of the urgency he clearly felt, matching the same calm, unhurried tone Dale had established, and asked her, gently, whether she remembered anything at all about the sticker, even just a shape or a color combination, anything, because stickers like that sometimes told you more than people expected. Maddie thought about it for a long moment, her small face screwed up in concentration, and then told him that it had been shaped like a circle, and that part of it had been blue and part had been white, like a pie cut in half, and that there had been letters on it, but she could not read them because the car had been moving and she had not been looking at the back of it for very long. Rick wrote this down carefully, the same patient, methodical attention he brought to every piece of information he gathered. And Dale, watching him work, felt the first thin thread of something that was not quite hope, but was at least direction. The sense that this terrible afternoon was already, less than half an hour after it happened, beginning to move from chaos into something the chapter knew exactly how to handle. Detective Carla Voss was still 20 minutes away, having been dispatched the moment Sandra's earlier call to the non-emergency line was upgraded once the dispatcher understood the nature of what had actually happened. And in those 20 minutes, working only from an 8-year-old's careful, precise memory and a notepad full of details that Dale had no intention of simply handing over and waiting on, Rick had already begun making calls of his own, the methodical machinery of the chapter's information network starting to turn well before any official investigation had even arrived at the house. Detective Carla Voss pulled up outside the Holt house at 4:18, 27 minutes after the dispatcher's call reached her directly, and sat in her car for a moment longer than strictly necessary, looking at the row of motorcycles she had not expected to find parked along the curb. 3 of them, and doing the quick mental recalibration she had learned to do across 13 years on the force, whenever a call took her somewhere she had not anticipated going. She knew, in the general way most people in this part of the county knew, that the Iron Cross chapter existed, that its president lived on this particular street, that the club maintained a reputation that ranged from grudging respect to active suspicion, depending on who in town you happened to ask. She had not expected, walking up the front path toward a house where an attempted child abduction had apparently just occurred, to find that the victim's father was the chapter president, or that he would already have at least one other member present and working the case before she had even taken a single formal statement. Dale answered the door himself, his manner controlled and courteous in a way that did not entirely match the obvious tension still visible in his shoulders, and he led her into the kitchen, where Maddie sat with her mother, the girl considerably calmer now than she had likely been 20 minutes earlier, and where Rick sat across the table with a notepad that Carla noted immediately, the specific, careful handwriting and the organized list of details that told her, before she had asked a single question herself, that someone in this house had already begun running their own parallel version of exactly the investigation she was here to conduct. She introduced herself to Maddie first, kneeling slightly to bring herself closer to the girl's eye level, the same instinct Dale had shown earlier, though Carla did not know that, and asked her gently to walk through what happened, taking her time, no rush, however she remembered it best. Maddie, with the same precision she had shown Rick minutes earlier, recounted the entire sequence again: the bus stop, the walk, the gray car, the almost right name, the missing code word, the running. And Carla listened carefully, writing her own notes, recognizing in the girl's account the specific clarity that sometimes came from genuinely careful prior safety training rather than simple childhood luck. When Maddie finished, Carla turned to Dale and asked, in the careful, professional tone she used when she needed information without wanting to create unnecessary friction, exactly what details he and Mr. Delaney here had already gathered, and whether they intended to share all of it with her department, or whether the chapter was planning to run its own separate effort alongside hers. Dale answered her directly, without hostility, but also without much give, telling her that the chapter would share everything they found, that he had no interest in obstructing her investigation, but that he was also not going to simply wait on the formal process while his daughter's safety remained an open question. That the chapter had resources and connections that moved considerably faster than any official channel could move, and that he intended to use every one of them, regardless of how the department felt about it. Carla had heard versions of this sentiment before from civilians frustrated with how slowly police work sometimes proceeded, and she understood the frustration, even when she did not love the implications of it. But something about the specific, calm, organized confidence in Dale's tone, and the notepad already sitting on the table with details her own forensics team had not yet had the chance to gather, told her this was not simply an angry father making empty threats about taking matters into his own hands. This was a man who had clearly already begun doing exactly that, methodically, before she had even arrived. And Carla, weighing the situation with the same quick professional calculation she applied to most difficult scenes, decided that open conflict with the chapter over jurisdiction was likely to slow her own investigation down considerably more than it would speed it up, and that her better option, at least for now, was a careful, watchful cooperation rather than a confrontation she was unlikely to win cleanly. She asked Rick directly what they had so far. Rick, after a brief glance toward Dale that received a small, confirming nod, read through the notepad, the gray sedan, the circular blue and white sticker, the short-haired man in his 30s or 40s, the dark jacket, and added one detail Carla had not yet heard, that he had already begun cross-referencing the partial sticker description against a list of local parking permit designs and dealership decals commonly used in the county, narrowing the possibilities considerably faster than Carla's own department's slower, formal request process for similar information would likely manage. Carla took this in with a controlled expression that did not fully hide her unease, both at the speed of it and at the clear sign that this particular investigation was not going to unfold the way her usual cases unfolded, with her department firmly in sole control of the pace and direction of every lead. She told Dale plainly that she appreciated the chapter's information, but needed to be clear that any actions taken against a suspect, once identified, needed to go through her department and the courts, not through whatever the chapter might be inclined to handle on their own. And Dale told her, with a controlled evenness that Carla could not quite decide whether to fully trust, that he understood her position completely, and that nobody in this house intended to do anything illegal. The statement landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of something that was technically true, and also clearly leaving considerable room underneath it. And Carla, recognizing that particular shape of careful honesty from 13 years of similar conversations, decided not to push the point further in this exact moment, choosing instead to focus on the actual investigation in front of her, rather than the uncertain question of what exactly the chapter intended to do once they found the man Maddie had described. She spent the next 40 minutes taking a full, formal statement from Maddie, gentler and slower than Rick's earlier questioning had needed to be, building the official record that would actually matter in court, regardless of whatever the chapter discovered on their own timeline. And as she worked, her phone buzzed twice with messages from her own department's records division, the slow, methodical, entirely proper channels finally beginning to turn, considerably behind the pace Rick had already established, sitting at this same kitchen table less than an hour earlier. By the time Carla left the Holt house just after 5:30, the official investigation formally opened and the statement properly recorded. Rick had already narrowed the sticker description down to 3 possible dealership decal designs used across the county, one of which, a used car lot on the industrial side of town, known locally for selling vehicles with minimal paperwork scrutiny, struck him as considerably more promising than the other 2, and he told Dale, standing in the driveway after Carla's car had pulled away, that he intended to drive out there himself before the evening was over. The used car lot on the industrial side of town, a place called Henley's, sat behind a sagging chain-link fence with a string of plastic pennant flags that had clearly been there since some long-forgotten grand opening, and Rick parked across the street at 6:15 that evening, studying the lot for a few minutes before he went in, the way he studied most things before committing to a direct approach. The owner, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Pete Henley, recognized the dealership decal Rick described immediately, told him it was the lot's standard sticker, applied to every vehicle they sold or leased going back at least 5 years. And when Rick asked, carefully, whether he kept records of which gray sedans had moved through the lot recently, Pete's expression shifted into the particular wariness of a man whose business model depended on asking customers fewer questions than most dealerships asked. And he told Rick that he would need to see some kind of official request before he started pulling records for anyone. Rick did not push the point that evening. He thanked Pete for his time, noted the lot's hours, and drove back to the chapter garage where Dale was waiting, the two of them deciding that Detective Voss, frustrating as the formal channel might be in terms of speed, was almost certainly going to get faster cooperation out of Pete Henley with an actual warrant or official request than Rick was going to get standing at the counter asking politely. And Dale, despite every instinct telling him to handle this entirely on the chapter's own timeline, called Carla directly that night and passed along exactly what Rick had found, the specific lot, the specific decal match, choosing cooperation in this particular instance because it was, by his own calculation, the faster path rather than the slower one. Carla had the warrant by Thursday morning, the speed of it owing considerably more to the specific lead Dale had handed her than to her department's usual processing timeline. And Pete Henley, faced with an actual legal document rather than a stranger's polite question, produced records within the hour showing exactly one gray sedan matching the general description, sold 3 weeks earlier under a cash transaction to a man named Curtis Lane. The paperwork sparse in exactly the way Pete's loose record-keeping habits tended to produce, but sufficient, combined with the vehicle's registration, to give both Carla and Rick, working their separate but now intersecting tracks, an actual name and an actual address. Carla called Dale that afternoon, a courtesy she had decided to extend partly out of genuine procedure and partly, she admitted to herself driving over, out of a growing recognition that keeping this particular family informed was probably safer than leaving them to find things out on their own timeline regardless. She told him they had identified Curtis Lane, that her department was preparing to bring him in for questioning, and that she needed Dale to understand clearly that this was now a police matter moving through proper channels, and that any independent action from the chapter risked compromising the case against him. Dale told her he understood, and thanked her for the call, and hung up the phone in his kitchen, with an expression that Sandra, watching from across the room, recognized immediately as the specific calm that came right before Dale did exactly what he had decided to do, regardless of what anyone had just told him not to do. He and 2 other members, Boone and a younger rider named Tate, were parked outside the address Henley's paperwork had listed for Curtis Lane, a run-down motel on the edge of town, by 7 that evening, considerably ahead of whatever timeline Carla's department was working toward bringing him in formally. Dale had decided, standing in his own kitchen an hour earlier, that he was not interested in violence, that Sandra's sharp, direct warning before he left, reminding him plainly that Maddie needed her father present and unharmed considerably more than she needed him doing anything reckless, had landed with real weight. But he was also not interested in waiting for the formal system to move at its own pace, while the man who approached his daughter remained, for the moment, simply a name on a piece of paper, rather than someone Dale had actually looked at directly. Curtis Lane answered the door of room 11, looking considerably less threatening in person than the careful, controlled fury building in Dale's chest had perhaps prepared him to expect. A thin, nervous man in his late 30s, with the specific, hollowed-out look of someone whose recent decisions had not been going well for him. And the moment he saw the 3 large men standing in the doorway, his face went through a rapid and unmistakable collapse from confusion into outright fear. Dale did not raise his voice. He told Curtis plainly who he was, and Curtis's face confirmed, before he said a single word, that the name meant exactly what Dale had suspected it would mean: recognition and dread arriving together. Dale told him he was not here to hurt him, that he wanted information, and that Curtis's best and only reasonable option right now was to give it to him completely and honestly, because the alternative, waiting for the police to formally process him through whatever slower legal timeline applied, was not actually going to protect him from the conversation Dale fully intended to have either way. Curtis backed into the room, Boone and Tate following Dale inside and closing the door behind them, and for a long moment, nobody said anything. Curtis sitting heavily on the edge of the unmade motel bed, with his hands pressed flat against his own knees, and Dale, standing over him without sitting, without raising his voice, without doing anything that crossed the specific line Sandra had drawn for him before he left the house, simply asked him, quietly and directly, why he had approached an 8-year-old girl outside her own house and told her he had been sent by her father. Curtis's hands tightened against his knees, and after a long moment, his voice considerably smaller than the careful, falsely friendly voice Maddie had described from the gray sedan's window, he told Dale that it had not been his idea, that he had been paid, that he had not known the girl personally and had not meant to actually hurt her, and that he could give Dale a name if it meant Dale walked back out that door and let the police handle the rest of it from here. And Dale, hearing the beginning of an answer he had been waiting all afternoon to hear, told him to keep talking, that the name was exactly what he needed, and that whether Dale walked back out that door calmly or not calmly was going to depend entirely on how completely and how honestly Curtis answered every single question that came next. Curtis Lane talked for the better part of 20 minutes once he started, the specific kind of talking that came from a man who had clearly been waiting, somewhere underneath his own fear, for someone to finally ask him the right questions so he could stop carrying the weight of what he had done entirely alone. He told Dale he had been approached 3 weeks earlier by a man he had known only loosely through a mutual acquaintance, a man who offered him $1,500 in cash for what he described as a simple job, scaring a girl into getting into a car for a few minutes before letting her go a few blocks away. No real harm intended, just enough to send a message to her father. Curtis told Dale he had needed the money badly enough that he had not asked too many questions about exactly why the job needed to happen at all, a decision he was now, sitting on the edge of a motel bed with 3 large bikers standing over him, regretting with the specific clarity of hindsight. Dale asked him what details the man had given him about Maddie specifically, her routine, her appearance, anything that would have required someone with real knowledge of Dale's own life rather than a stranger simply picking a target at random. And Curtis told him that he had been given a photograph, an address, the exact corner where the bus dropped her, and a description of her after-school routine detailed enough that whoever provided it clearly knew Dale's family considerably better than any random predator would have any reason to know. Dale's jaw tightened at this, the controlled stillness in his posture not changing, but something underneath it visibly hardening. And he asked the question that had been sitting at the center of his fury since the moment Maddie first told him about the missing code word. Whether the man had told Curtis anything about a specific word or phrase Maddie might say or ask for. Anything that would explain why Curtis had not used it. Curtis told him, with the particular honesty of a man past the point of trying to manage how badly his answers might land, that the man who hired him had specifically told him not to worry about any kind of code word, that the girl would not know to ask for one, that her parents were not the type to bother with that kind of careful precaution. And Dale, hearing this, felt something cold and entirely separate from his earlier fury settle into his chest. The specific realization that the man behind this had believed he knew Dale's parenting habits well enough to predict, confidently, that Maddie would have no safeguard in place at all. He had been wrong about that, completely and devastatingly wrong. And the gap between what the man behind this believed about Dale's family and the actual careful years of training Dale and Sandra had built into their daughter was the exact gap that had saved Maddie's life that afternoon, a fact that Dale absorbed standing in that motel room with a force that nearly buckled the careful control he had been maintaining since he first walked through the door. He asked Curtis for the name. Curtis hesitated for the first time since he had started talking, his eyes moving briefly toward Boone and Tate standing near the door before settling back on Dale. And then he said it, a name Dale had not heard spoken aloud in close to 15 years. Ellis Tanner. And the recognition that moved across Dale's face in that single moment was visible enough that even Curtis, frightened and exhausted as he was, noticed it immediately. Dale did not say anything for several seconds. The names sat in the small motel room with a weight that Boone and Tate, watching their president's face carefully, understood immediately carried history neither of them had been present for. Something old, something Dale had clearly not expected to ever surface again in any form, let alone in a form that had brought a hired stranger within feet of his own daughter. Curtis, watching Dale's silence with growing alarm, asked nervously whether that meant Dale knew the man, and Dale, recovering his composure with visible effort, told him yes, that he knew exactly who Ellis Tanner was, and that Curtis had just given him considerably more than a name. He had given him the missing piece of a question Dale had been quietly carrying, without fully admitting it to himself, since the moment Maddie first described the man in the gray sedan. The question of why anyone would target his daughter specifically, rather than simply attacking Dale directly. And the answer, sitting now fully formed in front of him, was that someone from Dale's own past had decided his daughter was the most effective way to finally reach a man who could not otherwise be reached. Dale told Curtis, before he left the motel room, exactly what was going to happen next, that Curtis was going to call Detective Voss's department himself, tonight, before Dale even walked out of the building, and give them everything he had just given Dale, the payment, the photograph, the address, every detail, because Dale was not interested in handling Curtis's part of this outside the formal system. The man had been a paid hand rather than the actual architect of the plan, and the formal system was perfectly capable of handling someone in Curtis's position appropriately. What Dale was not yet certain about, walking out of the motel into the cool evening air with Boone and Tate following behind him in a silence that none of the three men felt any need to break, was exactly how he intended to handle Ellis Tanner himself, a man who, as far as Dale's careful memory could reconstruct standing in that parking lot, he had not laid eyes on in nearly 15 years, and who Dale had genuinely believed, until 20 minutes earlier, belonged entirely and permanently to a part of his life he had long since closed the door on. Ellis Tanner had ridden with the Iron Cross chapter for 6 years, back when Dale was still rising through the ranks rather than leading them, and for most of those 6 years, he and Dale had been close in the specific way two men become close when they spend years riding the same roads and standing the same watches. Not quite friends in the deepest sense, but bound by the kind of loyalty the chapter required and generally produced. The falling out, when it came, happened over money, the way most lasting grudges inside the chapter eventually traced back to money or pride, frequently both at once. Ellis had been entrusted, 15 years earlier, with managing a portion of the chapter's shared fund, money the members pooled together for emergencies, medical costs, funeral expenses, the kind of fund every chapter kept and every member contributed to and trusted would be there when they actually needed it. Ellis had used a significant portion of that fund to cover a gambling debt he had accumulated quietly over several months, confident he could replace it before anyone noticed. A confidence that proved badly misplaced when a member's wife needed emergency surgery and the fund came up several $1,000s short of what it should have held. Dale, vice president at the time, had been the one to discover the shortfall and the one who had pushed, over the strong objections of several members who argued for a quieter resolution that would spare Ellis public humiliation, for full transparency with the entire chapter about what had happened. Ellis had been formally expelled, the harshest consequence the chapter could impose short of physical retribution. And Dale, in the chapter meeting where the final vote was taken, had been the deciding voice that tipped the room toward expulsion rather than a lesser punishment, a fact Ellis had apparently never forgotten or forgiven across the 15 years since, even though Dale himself, by his own honest recollection standing in his garage that evening turning the entire history over in his mind, had genuinely believed at the time that he was simply doing what the situation required, rather than pursuing any personal vendetta against a man who had, until that point, been something close to a friend. He had heard almost nothing about Ellis in the years since. A rumor once that he had moved to another state. Another rumor a few years later that he had fallen into serious financial trouble again. Nothing concrete enough that Dale had ever felt any particular need to follow up on it, the way a person sometimes simply lets an old chapter of their life close without checking back to see how the people in it ultimately fared. What Dale had not considered, not once across 15 years, was that Ellis Tanner had apparently spent some unknown portion of those years nursing a grievance specific and bitter enough that when an opportunity arose to hurt Dale in a way that would actually land, he had chosen, deliberately and with real planning, Dale's own 8-year-old daughter as the instrument. Rick spent Thursday night and most of Friday tracking down where Ellis actually was now, working through the same patient, methodical channels he had used to identify Curtis Lane, old chapter contacts who might have kept loose track of him, public records, the slow accumulation of small details that eventually produced an address 2 counties over, a modest rental house where Ellis had apparently been living for the past 3 years, working, according to one contact's second-hand information, an unglamorous job at a regional distribution warehouse. The specific, quiet, diminished circumstances of a man whose life had clearly not gone the direction he might once have hoped it would. Dale sat with this information for the better part of a day before deciding what to do with it. A longer pause than Rick had expected from him, given the speed of everything else across the previous several days. And when Rick asked him directly, late Friday afternoon, what he wanted to do, Dale told him something that surprised even Rick, who had known him for nearly 2 decades. That he wanted to go alone, just himself, no other members present. A request that ran directly against the chapter's usual instinct to handle anything this serious as a group rather than as an individual confrontation. Rick pushed back gently, reminding Dale that going alone to confront a man who had just demonstrated, through Curtis Lane, a willingness to target Dale's own child was not exactly the most cautious approach available. And Dale, listening to the concern without dismissing it, told Rick that he understood the risk, but that whatever conversation he needed to have with Ellis Tanner was not going to be a conversation that worked properly with an audience. That he had known this man once, had been the deciding vote in the worst moment of Ellis's adult life, and that he owed it to the actual history between them, complicated and ugly as it now was, to hear whatever Ellis had to say directly, rather than arriving with 3 other large men standing behind him, the way he had arrived at Curtis Lane's motel room. He told Sandra the same thing that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Maddie had gone to bed, and Sandra, who had spent the past 3 days watching her husband channel his fear into the most controlled and disciplined version of himself she had ever seen, told him she trusted his judgment on this specific point, even though every protective instinct in her own body wanted him to bring backup regardless. And she asked him only one thing before he left the following morning, that he call her the moment the conversation was over, whatever the outcome, so she would not spend the entire drive imagining worse things than whatever actually happened. Dale promised her he would, and on Saturday morning, 2 counties over, he parked outside a modest rental house that did not look like it belonged to a man capable of arranging the attempted abduction of a child, and sat in his truck for several minutes, the same careful, deliberate pause he had learned across years to take before any conversation that mattered, before he finally got out and walked toward the front door, uncertain, for the first time in this entire ordeal, exactly what he was going to find on the other side of it. Detective Carla Voss had Curtis Lane's full statement by Friday morning, the call he made to her department directly from the motel room, exactly as Dale had instructed him to, arriving with a level of detail and cooperation that her usual interrogations rarely produced this cleanly. The photograph of Maddie, the address and routine information, the cash payment, The explicit instruction not to bother with any kind of code word because the girl would not know to ask for one. All of it laid out in a confession that practically built the case for her. She sat with the statement for a long while afterward, turning over the specific, uncomfortable recognition that the entire foundation of this confession existed only because Dale Holt had gone to that motel room before her department's own warrant process had fully caught up, a fact she was not entirely comfortable with professionally and was finding increasingly difficult to argue against practically, given how clean and how fast the resulting information actually was. She called her captain, a measured man named Reyes, who had run the department for 9 years and had developed, across that time, a working philosophy about outlaw motorcycle clubs that fell somewhere between wary tolerance and grudging respect, depending on the specific chapter and the specific situation. Carla laid out the entire timeline for him, the chapter's faster identification of the sticker and the dealership, Dale's visit to the motel before her department's formal warrant, the full confession that resulted, and told him plainly that she was uncertain how to feel about a case where the civilian father had effectively outpaced her own investigative process at every single stage. Reyes listened without interrupting, and then asked her the only question that actually mattered to him: whether the information Dale's people had provided was accurate, and whether it was going to hold up in court. Carla told him yes to both, that everything Curtis Lane had told Dale matched exactly what he had subsequently told her department, that there were no inconsistencies suggesting anything had been coerced or fabricated, and that the physical evidence, the vehicle registration, the cash withdrawal records they were now pulling on Curtis's own accounts, all corroborated the same account from multiple independent angles. Reyes told her, with the specific weary pragmatism of a man who had stopped expecting every case to unfold according to textbook procedure a long time ago, that if the information was accurate and the case was strong, he was not particularly interested in litigating, internally, exactly how fast or how unconventionally it had come together. That her job was to build a prosecutable case against the people who tried to take a child off the street, and that a father moving quickly to protect his own daughter, while not something the department could officially endorse as a model for how civilians should behave, was also not something Reyes intended to spend much energy condemning, given the actual outcome in front of them. Carla took this guidance and formally charged Curtis Lane with attempted kidnapping that same Friday afternoon. The charge built on a foundation considerably stronger and considerably faster assembled than her department's standard process would likely have produced working entirely on its own. And she found herself, driving home that evening, turning over an uncomfortable but increasingly difficult to avoid conclusion: that whatever discomfort she still felt about the chapter's parallel investigation, the actual result of it had been a faster, cleaner, more thoroughly corroborated case than she could honestly claim her own department would have built without it. She called Dale that same evening, partly out of genuine procedural courtesy, and partly, she admitted to herself, out of a need to actually say something to him directly about the uncomfortable position his actions had put her in professionally, even as those actions had simultaneously made her job considerably easier. She told him Curtis Lane had been formally charged, that his confession matched everything they already knew, and that she wanted him to understand clearly that she still believed strongly in the formal process and still had real concerns about the chapter operating outside it, but that she was not going to pretend the information he had provided had not been accurate, useful, and faster than her own department's resources would likely have managed alone. Dale thanked her and then told her, with a careful honesty that Carla had not entirely expected, that he understood her position completely and respected it. That he had not gone to that motel room to undermine her investigation, but because he had not been willing to wait while his daughter's safety remained for even a single additional day, an open question rather than a settled one, and that he intended, going forward, to continue handing her department everything the chapter uncovered, exactly as he had with Curtis Lane, because the actual goal here was not the chapter operating in defiance of the police. It was making absolutely certain that whoever was behind this faced real and lasting consequences through whatever combination of formal and informal pressure actually achieved that outcome. Carla asked him, carefully, whether the chapter had identified who hired Curtis Lane yet, and Dale told her yes, a name from his own past, and that he intended to handle the initial conversation with that man personally, before bringing whatever resulted from it back to her department for the formal process to take over. A plan Carla found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, not actively objecting to, having spent the past 2 days watching this particular family's approach to the situation produce results her own slower process had repeatedly struggled to match at every single turn. She hung up the phone that evening with a complicated and genuinely shifted understanding of exactly who Dale Holt and the Iron Cross chapter actually were. An understanding considerably more nuanced than the wary, vaguely suspicious assumption she had carried walking up to that house 4 days earlier. And she found herself, driving past the Holt house later that same week on an unrelated patrol route, slowing slightly as she passed, watching Maddie playing in the front yard with her mother nearby, and feeling, for the first time in a long professional career, built largely around careful procedural skepticism, something close to genuine gratitude toward a group of men her training had taught her, for years, to regard with considerably more caution than trust. Ellis Tanner opened his front door on Saturday morning, expecting, by the careful, guarded way he held the door only part-way open, someone other than the bills collector or delivery driver his face had clearly braced for. And the moment his eyes actually settled on Dale, standing alone on his small porch, every muscle in his face went through a rapid sequence Dale recognized immediately. Recognition first, then something close to fear. And underneath both of those, visible only for a fraction of a second before Ellis managed to suppress it, something that looked uncomfortably close to relief. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Dale stood with his hands loose at his sides, deliberately, the same controlled posture he had used in Curtis Lane's motel room, and Ellis stood half-hidden behind his own door, 15 years older than the man Dale remembered, thinner, grayer, the specific diminished quality of someone whose life had clearly not unfolded the way he might once have imagined it would. Dale told him quietly that he knew what Ellis had paid Curtis Lane to do, and Ellis's face, after a long moment of visible internal calculation about whether denial was even worth attempting, simply collapsed into something closer to exhaustion than defiance. He stepped back from the door without being asked and told Dale he could come in, the specific resignation of a man who had apparently been waiting, in some form, for exactly this confrontation since the moment he hired Curtis weeks earlier. They sat in Ellis's small, sparsely furnished living room, and for a long while neither man said much of anything, the silence carrying considerably more weight than either of them seemed ready to break, until Dale finally asked him directly why. Why his own daughter specifically? Why, after 15 years of apparent silence, Ellis had decided this was the moment and this was the method. Ellis told him, his voice rougher than Dale remembered it, that the past 15 years had not gone the way Dale's comfortable, successful chapter presidency had clearly gone. That the expulsion had cost him considerably more than the chapter itself. That word of why he had been expelled had spread through circles connected to the chapter widely enough that it had cost him jobs, relationships, an entire community he had spent years building his identity around, and that he had spent a very long time believing, rightly or wrongly, that Dale specifically had been the deciding voice that turned a private, repayable mistake into a public, permanent humiliation that had followed him for a decade and a half. Dale listened to this without interrupting, and when Ellis finished, he told him, with the same careful honesty he had brought to every conversation across this entire ordeal, that he remembered the vote clearly, That he had believed at the time, and still believed now, that full transparency had been the right call given what the fund existed for, and given the member's wife who had genuinely needed that money for emergency surgery. But that he also understood, hearing Ellis describe the years since, that the consequence had clearly extended far beyond anything Dale had specifically intended or even considered at the time, and that he was sorry the aftermath had cost Ellis as much as it apparently had. Ellis's hands, resting on his knees, tightened visibly at this, and he told Dale, his voice cracking slightly in a way that surprised them both, that he understood, completely and rationally, that targeting an 8-year-old girl who had nothing to do with any of it was not justice, was not even close to justice, that he had known it even as he was arranging it, and that he had done it anyway because 15 years of accumulated bitterness had finally curdled into something he no longer fully recognized in himself. A decision he told Dale he had already begun regretting within hours of paying Curtis Lane, though regret, he acknowledged, did not undo what had nearly happened. Dale sat with this for a long moment, the careful discipline that had carried him through this entire week holding steady, even as something underneath it shifted slightly. Not toward forgiveness exactly, but toward a more complicated understanding than the simple, clean vengeance narrative he might have expected to feel walking up to this house an hour earlier. He told Ellis plainly that understanding the years of grievance behind this did not excuse what he had done, that nothing excused targeting a child, and that Ellis was going to face the full formal consequences the legal system applied to arranging an attempted kidnapping, that Dale was not going to use his own connections or influence to soften that outcome in any way. But he told him also that he had decided, sitting in his truck outside this house 20 minutes earlier, that he was not going to bring the kind of physical retribution to this conversation that several members of his own chapter would have expected and perhaps even preferred. That real justice, in Dale's considered view, meant Ellis facing the actual legal consequences of what he had done through the proper system, fully and without any chapter interference shielding him from it, rather than Dale simply handling it himself in a way that might feel satisfying in the moment, but would ultimately just be another version of the same cycle of personal grievance and improvised retribution that had apparently brought Ellis to this point in the first place. Ellis nodded slowly at this, something in his posture loosening slightly. Not relief exactly, but the specific, exhausted acceptance of a man who had perhaps expected, walking into this conversation, that violence was the most likely outcome, and was now recalibrating to a different, and in some ways harder, reality. Actual accountability, rather than a single bad afternoon followed by an attempt to simply move forward unchanged. Dale called Detective Voss from his truck the moment he walked back outside, gave her Ellis Tanner's name and address, and told her everything Ellis had admitted to him directly. And Carla, listening on the other end of the line, asked him, with genuine curiosity rather than professional suspicion, why Dale had chosen to handle the initial confrontation the way he apparently had. Calmly, without backup, without violence, rather than the version of events her training had half prepared her to expect from an outlaw club president confronting the man who had targeted his own daughter. Dale told her simply that real justice and pure vengeance were not, in his considered view, ever actually the same thing, no matter how satisfying vengeance might feel in the moment, and that what mattered considerably more to him than punishing Ellis personally was making absolutely certain Ellis faced the full and permanent legal consequences of what he had done, consequences that Dale fully intended to make sure stuck this time, with no chapter loyalty or quiet internal handling softening the outcome the way it perhaps had, in some smaller form, 15 years earlier. Ellis Tanner was formally arrested on Monday morning, the warrant built on Curtis Lane's full confession, Dale's account of his own conversation with Ellis, and the financial records that eventually surfaced showing the cash withdrawal Ellis had made to pay Curtis weeks earlier. A case considerably stronger and considerably faster assembled than Carla had any reasonable expectation of building when this entire situation began the previous Wednesday afternoon. Rick told Dale about the arrest that evening, the two of them sitting in the garage the way they often did when something serious required discussion away from the rest of the chapter. And it was during that same conversation that Rick raised, carefully, the question several of the more hard-line members had already begun asking him privately: why Dale had chosen restraint with Ellis when the man had come within minutes of taking Maddie off the street entirely. Why a single quiet conversation and a phone call to the police felt, to several long-standing members, like an inadequate response to something this serious. Dale had anticipated this question, had in fact expected it considerably sooner than Rick finally brought it to him directly, and he answered it with the same careful, deliberate honesty he had brought to every difficult conversation across the past several days. He told Rick that he understood completely why some of the older members felt that way, that 15 years ago he might have felt the exact same way himself, that there was a part of him, even now, that wanted nothing more than to have handled Ellis Tanner with considerably less restraint than he actually had. But he told Rick something else as well, something he had been turning over since the moment Curtis Lane first said Ellis's name in that motel room, that the entire situation had originated 15 years earlier, from a moment where the chapter's own internal justice, however correct the underlying decision had been about the fund itself, had produced consequences that spiraled, over years, into something none of them had intended or even imagined. A man's entire life slowly curdling into bitterness severe enough that he eventually targeted a child to express it. Dale told Rick that he was not interested in repeating that same pattern, punishing Ellis in some informal, improvised way that might feel satisfying in the moment, but that risked, over enough years, producing exactly the kind of festering grievance that had led to this entire crisis in the first place. He told Rick that real accountability, in his considered view, meant Ellis facing the full, formal weight of the legal system, charges that would stick, consequences that could not be quietly negotiated away or softened by chapter connections the way certain things sometimes were, and that this, to Dale, was actually the harder and more lasting form of justice, rather than the easier and more immediately satisfying alternative several members apparently wanted from him. Rick listened to all of this and told Dale, after a long moment of consideration, that he understood the reasoning even if he suspected not every member would fully come around to it. And Dale told him he knew that too, that he was not asking the entire chapter to agree with him, only to trust that he had thought this through with considerably more care than a single moment of unchecked anger would have allowed, and that the actual outcome, Ellis facing real and lasting legal consequences, rather than a single bad afternoon Dale's own hands might have delivered, was the outcome Dale actually believed in. A handful of members did push back in the days that followed, conversations that Dale handled directly and individually rather than avoiding, listening to each concern fully before explaining his reasoning the same way he had explained it to Rick. And while not every member fully agreed by the end of those conversations, the chapter's overall standing behind Dale's decision held. The specific respect several decades of careful, consistent leadership had built proving sturdy enough to absorb this one significant disagreement without fracturing anything underneath it. At home, Maddie's recovery from the entire ordeal had progressed with a resilience that continued to surprise both her parents. The specific adaptability children sometimes showed that adults, carrying the heavier emotional weight of nearly losing something irreplaceable, struggled to match at the same pace. She had asked her father, on the Sunday evening before Ellis's arrest, sitting at the kitchen table while Dale helped her with a school project, what had actually happened to the man in the gray car. And Dale, crouching down to her eye level the way he always did for anything serious, gave her an honest but carefully age-appropriate version of events. that the man had been caught, that he was going to face real consequences for what he tried to do, and that the chapter had also found the person who had paid him to do it and made sure that person was going to face consequences too. Maddie considered this for a long moment, and then asked her father the question that revealed, more clearly than anything else across the entire ordeal, exactly how much she had actually absorbed and processed, rather than simply survived. She asked him whether the man who paid for it had been someone Dale knew, and Dale, surprised by the precision of the question, told her honestly that yes, it had been someone from a long time ago, someone Dale used to ride with before Maddie was even born. Maddie sat with this for a moment, her small face working through something with the same careful concentration she had shown identifying the gray sedan's sticker. And then she asked her father whether that meant being angry at someone for a really long time could eventually make a person do something really bad, even something they probably knew deep down was wrong. Dale looked at his daughter for a long moment, struck by the weight of an 8-year-old arriving, on her own, at the exact moral center of everything the past week had actually been about. And he told her, honestly, that yes, that was exactly what it could mean. That carrying anger for too long without ever putting it down could eventually grow into something that hurt people who had nothing to do with the original problem at all. And that this was part of why he tried, even when it was difficult, to handle his own anger carefully rather than letting it grow unchecked for years, the way it apparently had for the man who hurt her. Maddie nodded slowly, the answer apparently settling into place somewhere important, and then, with the specific, abrupt practicality of an 8-year-old whose attention had fully processed what it needed to process for the moment, she asked her father if they could finish her school project now, and Dale, his chest tight with a complicated mixture of love and relief, and something close to genuine awe at his own daughter's resilience, told her yes, absolutely, and pulled his chair closer to hers. Ellis Tanner pleaded guilty in March, 4 months after Dale's careful, unaccompanied visit to his small rental house, accepting a sentence that his attorney had negotiated down somewhat from the harshest possible charge, but that still carried real and lasting weight. Several years that would, by any honest accounting, reshape the remainder of his life considerably more than the original 15 years of quiet bitterness ever had. Curtis Lane received a lesser sentence, given his full cooperation and his clear status as a paid hand rather than the architect of the plan. A distinction Detective Voss had carefully documented in the case file, and that the court ultimately recognized in the final outcome. Dale attended Ellis's sentencing, sitting quietly near the back of the courtroom, a decision that surprised Rick when Dale mentioned it the night before, and when Rick asked him why he intended to go at all, given everything that had happened. Dale told him simply that he wanted to see the formal process through to its actual conclusion. Not out of any lingering need for personal satisfaction, but because he had told Ellis, standing in that small living room months earlier, that real accountability mattered more to him than improvised vengeance. And he felt he owed it to that statement, and to himself, to actually witness the system delivering on it, rather than simply walking away the moment his own direct involvement ended. He did not speak to Ellis at the sentencing, and Ellis, led out afterward in handcuffs, did not look toward the back of the courtroom where Dale sat, the two men's complicated, 15-year history finally settling into something with an actual, formal conclusion, rather than the long, unresolved bitterness that had apparently festered, unspoken, for so many years on Ellis's side alone. By spring, the bus stop on Birchwood and Lane had returned to something close to its old ordinary rhythm, Maddie stepping down from the bus at 3:41 exactly as she always had, except that now, without any particular ceremony or announcement, 2 chapter members, usually Boone and occasionally Tate, had simply made the half-block walk part of their regular routine, not standing over her protectively in any way that drew attention or made Maddie feel singled out, but walking a comfortable distance behind or alongside, chatting about ordinary things, the kind of casual, unremarkable presence that had become, across the preceding months, simply how things were now, rather than a visible reminder of anything frightening. Maddie herself had grown, in the specific way children sometimes grow through difficult experiences rather than simply around them, into a slightly more careful, but not at all diminished version of who she had been before. Her sharp attention to detail, the trait that had ultimately saved her life that Wednesday afternoon, becoming something she seemed to take a quiet, private pride in, rather than something that frightened her to think about. She had started, on her own initiative, paying closer attention to license plates on the drive to school, calling them out to her mother as a small game, the same precise habit that had once been a careful safety lesson, now simply a piece of who Maddie had decided she was. The code word itself had undergone its own quiet transformation across those months, from the single most important safeguard in Maddie's young life into something closer to a private family joke. Dale had noticed it first on an ordinary Tuesday evening, calling up the stairs to tell Maddie dinner was ready, and Maddie, leaning over the banister with a small grin, had called back down asking him, in a deliberately exaggerated, suspicious tone, whether he actually knew the word. And Dale, catching the joke immediately, had answered her seriously, playing along. And the two of them had gone through the entire small ritual, Dale saying the word, Maddie nodding with mock solemnity before announcing she would indeed come down for dinner. A private routine that had, by spring, repeated often enough to become simply part of the ordinary texture of their evenings. The phrase that had once meant the difference between safety and danger, now meaning, simply and warmly, home. Detective Carla Voss stopped by the Holt house once more in April, not for any case-related reason, but, as she explained somewhat awkwardly to Sandra at the front door, because she had found herself, across the months since this entire situation resolved, genuinely wanting to check in and see how Maddie was actually doing. A gesture that fell well outside her usual professional habits, and that she attributed, when Sandra asked her gently about it over coffee, to the simple fact that this particular case had changed something in how she thought about the chapter more broadly. That watching a father channel genuine fury into something this disciplined and this thoughtful had taught her something about the Iron Cross chapter that 13 years of careful, professional wariness had never quite shown her on its own. Dale, coming home from the garage that same afternoon and finding Carla's car still in the driveway, sat with her and Sandra at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, the conversation moving easily between them in a way that would have seemed entirely impossible standing in that same kitchen the previous October. The detective who had once eyed the chapter's parallel investigation with open professional suspicion, now simply a guest at the table, genuinely invested in how a particular 8-year-old girl was actually doing. That evening, after Carla had left and Maddie had gone up to bed, Dale stood for a long moment at the kitchen window, looking out at the quiet street. Boone's motorcycle parked, as it sometimes still was on certain evenings, a few houses down where he had stopped to talk with a neighbor on his way home from picking Maddie up that afternoon. And Dale felt, standing there, the specific, settled quality of a danger that had passed completely, rather than one merely being managed. The careful discipline he had maintained across every difficult decision of the past several months finally allowed, in this particular ordinary moment, to simply rest. Upstairs, Maddie called down one last time before falling asleep, asking, half joking and half genuinely sleepy, whether her father knew the password to come up and say goodnight. And Dale, climbing the stairs, said the word. The same 4 syllables that had once been the entire, fragile difference between his daughter running home safely and something Dale could not bear to fully imagine. And Maddie, hearing it, smiled and told him good night, the word now simply and completely what it had always been meant to be underneath everything else. A small, private proof that the people who loved her were exactly who they said they were. The house settled into quiet. The word, once a warning, was finally only ever just a welcome. An 8-year-old girl walked half a block from her bus stop the same way she had 100 times before. A man in a gray sedan called her by the wrong name, told her he had been sent by her father, and told her to get in. She did not. She remembered one missing word, and she ran. That single detail, a code word her father had practiced with her for years just in case, was the entire difference between an ordinary Wednesday afternoon and a tragedy. It took years of quiet, patient preparation that nobody ever expected to actually need, and it worked in the one moment that mattered. What came after was not revenge. It was something harder and more deliberate. A father who had every reason to let his fury take over and chose discipline instead. Because real justice, in his words, was never the same thing as vengeance. The man who arranged it all turned out to be someone from his own past, a reminder that bitterness left unchecked for long enough can grow into something none of us would recognize in ourselves. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us what you think you would have done in Dale's place. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you are here for the next one. And if you have a child in your life, maybe tonight is the night you practice a code word of your own. We will see you in the next one.